Thanks very much to UNU-WIDER for inviting me to share some of my, well, not my research, mine and co-authors on work that we have done in the past in 2023. It's a combination of papers that we've completed, and it's all UNU-WIDER working papers. So you'll see a lot of results in the papers, but I don't have time to discuss them in detail. And so I'm also going to do what the past speakers have done. I'm just going to give you the gist of it and allow you to come and discuss with me afterwards, and also have a look at the working papers if you have time. Okay, so the title, Taxing the Poor or Fixing the System. I think that's a big ask for a 12-minute presentation, but I'm going to share some ideas that we have on this. And it's basically alternatives to the VAT rate increase, because as the previous speaker has indicated, when the South African government increased the VAT rate at the beginning of the year by 2%, there was an outroar. They came back with a new proposal to stagger the increase by 0.5% per year and increase the zero-rated items. And again, that was not accepted. And obviously, that's an important part of a tax, that it must be acceptable, to the taxpayers. And so that was then repealed, and now we have a focus on the expenditure side of the budget with, increased compliance being the focus of trying to raise revenues. I just want to also say something about, and I've given you, just what I've said in one or two lines, but I think it's important to stress the macro perspective, and Tutuk has done that by indicating the debt to GDP situation we have in South Africa. We have a debt to GDP ratio of 77%. We have the highest inequality in the world. Our debt cost of paying our debt, servicing the debt, is like 1 billion rand per day. The rand is about 20 rand for €1 approximately. And so you can think that we are spending quite an awful part of our budget just trying to service the debt that we have. And unfortunately, from a macro perspective, unemployment very high, growth very low, so we are in a dire state. The OECD report that just basically came out, I think a week ago on South Africa and the South African economy, has specified that we are, as we all know, we're heading for a crisis. And so we really need to give dire attention to the more macro perspective. My focus in the 12 minutes or 10 minutes is going to be on a more micro perspective. But I want to add that this is sort of putting the micro focus, but we need to take the broader context into account. And so these policy interventions that we are proposing is really, it's going to contribute to raising domestic revenue mobilization, but it's not going to be the solution. We need to think much broader as to how we're going to drive our economy forward. So just maybe something on the methodology that we used in the working papers. So the two papers that I'm going to discuss in brief, we used microsimulation models. The one is called the SA mod. You may be familiar with the SA mod or the self-mod simulation models. It's basically tax benefit simulation models that will allow us to simulate policy interventions. So I used the SA mod very briefly just to check what would happen if we do increase the VAT rate. I did not simulate zero-rated items, but basically what this will give you is an increase in revenue, and I just need to qualify that the data that the SA mod is based on is outdated. It's the 2015 Living Conditions Survey in South Africa, and it's really outdated. You can update this, but it's not going to be an accurate reflection of what we can expect in terms of the results. But that said, obviously, if you do increase the VAT rate, then there's going to be increased revenues. Just taking note of the fact that these are static models, so that when you look at these results, just note that it does not take into account behavioral responses. And I mean, these graphs are really just showing you, just very briefly, what we initially looked at in terms of what a VAT rate, and this is a 1%, not the initial 2%. But I think my focus for the next couple of minutes that I have is to really look at alternatives. And Tutuka has really, you've started with that in terms of personal income tax. But I want to add to what you've done and consider tax expenditures, which I think is something that we talk about in South Africa and that we need to look at, but we don't really give it serious attention. And so the first one that I really want to talk about is work that we've done on pension fund contributions as deductions in terms of tax expenditures. So we did a paper in 2023. It was part of the SA Tide program that's funded and worked jointly with UNU-WIDER. And we looked at what would happen if we either firstly abolished the tax expenditure, which is if you contribute to your retirement annuity, you can deduct that from your taxable income, and that's a benefit to those who are making contributions. What happens if we abolish that versus what happens if we were to convert this into a tax credit? Now, previous work has actually looked at this in terms of the medical tax contributions, because that's also a tax expenditure in South Africa. And given the inequality in South Africa, obviously the benefits of these tax expenditures flow to the highest income groups. So this is the motivation as to why we considered then, looking at this particular tax expenditure. So the first one that you see on the slide here is abolishing the deduction of tax retirement contributions. And without going into all the detail, I've listed the working paper details. You can go and have a look at the paper. But basically what we find is that obviously there's going to be a revenue increase because now you're taking away this benefit. And what we observe then in terms of the graph, and here you can see that it's the groups are divided by taxable income. That the biggest last year seems, or the biggest sort of increase seems to be the middle income group there. So what we found when we looked at the data is that we have small contributions by, sort of the middle income groups, whereas your highest or top income groups, they contribute obviously the largest amounts. And I just want to say that this work was done using a simulation model once again. And the model is called PITMOD, and it's quite a unique model for within a developing country context because we use tax administrative data that's underpinning the simulation model. So it's again a static model, but it does use the tax records, the individualized tax records, and it does then provide an opportunity to do a much more refined and nuanced analysis of these potential policy interventions. What we then basically look at is how this would change, or this outcome would change, if we were to, for example, convert this into a tax credit. So instead of allowing it as a deduction, we then convert this into a tax credit, and the idea is then to assume that the tax credit will be converted at a rate of 26%, which is sort of the tax group, if you look at the tax schedule, the tax group at which the average taxpayer is contributing to pension funds. And so, and that would be the marginal tax rate of the second income bracket. And now you can see if we compare the reform scenario, which is now this conversion of the retirement contribution deduction to a tax credit at a rate of 26% versus the baseline, where it's still a tax deduction, that we do observe some benefit to the lower income groups and more of the tax liability now lying with the higher income groups. And so this then sort of allows us to see that we are then sort of targeting our higher income earners with an increase in tax liability. So they're losing most of the benefit, and some of the benefit then flows to your lower income groups because they are now, or their contributions are obviously then converted at a higher rate, and they are falling within lower tax brackets. So that was the work on the tax expenditures. I also wanted to share some work with you that we completed with, and Yuka was part of the team here, that we completed with Gemma Wright and Michael Noble from Sasprey, and they used also the PIT-mod as background as methodology for this consideration. And here we looked more closely at the PIT system once more. But we now looked at whether we could be deepening the tax base or broadening the tax base. And so you'll see that the first one was to look at how we could add additional taxpayers into the top tax bands and increasing the tax rates and the tax bands. And then secondly, looking at broadening the tax base by lowering the minimum tax threshold. So South Africa has quite well, compared to other countries, other developing countries, we have a higher tax threshold. And what one potential opportunity then is to lower the tax threshold. Now, of course, that would mean that the tax burden would increase for those in lower income groups. But combined with the second option, we also sort of considered what would happen if you introduced a lower tax rate for those coming into the tax net. And so, based on these two potential options of changing our personal income tax, what we find is that when we look at the different reforms, so reform one would be just to change the top or the tax rates and the tax bands, and that would be for the higher income groups. The second reform option that we considered was to lower the tax threshold, and the third reform was a combination of two, included both. You will also note that I specify here, and this comes from the working paper, without a behavioral response and with a behavioral response. So here, although the model is a static model, we incorporated sort of existing, empirical work on the elasticity of taxable income, and that was used as a mechanism to also estimate behavioral responses. So that gives you the change in tax revenues, but I think importantly what we would also want to look at is the distributional impact. One thing that we do observe here is that these are more sort of refined or nuanced changes, but it can bring us additional tax revenues. And obviously the question we have to ask is to what extent this is going to have distributional effects across the taxpayer spectrum. And so what the paper then does is to look at different, sort of indices to measure what that distributional impact would be. And based on that, we do find very small impacts on the distribution. But maybe just to quickly end off, and you'll find all of this in the papers. I think what's important in the South African context is that yes, we have to look at the broader fiscal space. We have to look at the broader economic space. And I think we have much work to do there. We need to look at our institutions. We need to look at governance. But also from a tax perspective, I do think we need to take a multi-pronged strategy approach in terms of considering, modest VAT increases. I'm not against VAT increases, but I do think we need to think about how it affects people and what kind of policies we do put in place to try and mitigate those impacts. Reviewing the personal income tax, and I think what Laura has also mentioned about more closely looking at capital income, wealth, and looking at more effectively using taxes on capital income to try and improve revenue. But be sort of aware of the impacts it can have on fairness and sustainability. And I think that's it from my side. I think fair tax reform, it is possible, but it needs us to look beyond just the obvious, policy options that we have been analyzing. I think I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.